Hi, everybody, and welcome back to HCD's Mindset vidcast, Season 2, where we're doing a lot more discussions with friends of ours. And today we have a really cool discussion we're going to be having with Michael here, which is going to introduce him in just a moment. But we're going to continue our conversation that we've had on recent webinars and panel discussions about navigating norms. And this time we're going to actually focus a little more on education that people are getting as they enter the workforce and how important that really is. So without further ado, I'm going to launch right into it. Introducing who we are. My name is Michelle Niedziela, VP of Research and Innovation at HCD and resident behavioral neuroscientist. Joined as always by Kathryn Ambroze. Kathryn.
Hi, everybody. Yep, Kathryn Ambroze here. I'm the manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD Research. And I'm going to let Michelle share a little bit about our company before we hop into conversations.
Yeah, so as you may remember, for those of you that are returning with us, but those of you that are new, let me give you a little bit of the lowdown on who we are. HCD is a consumer and market research house focusing on the consumer experience, perceiving, evaluating, responding to different types of stimuli. We use all sorts of different tools from traditional market research all the way through applied consumer neuroscience, all in to look at how we can better product packaging and communications for consumers. This can be done across all channels of the human experience, from early stages of exploration all the way through the end stages of validation, product development, through marketing. Our work can be done all over the world, whether it's online or in person. And that's a little bit who we are. So let's skip over that and go straight to our guest today before we launch into our discussion. Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've got a great pedigree here and you're doing some really wonderful work at Michigan State University. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. And thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this. This is great. And so, yeah, as the slide there shows, with a picture of a much younger me. So I very appreciate you picking that one out. That's very nice.
I think it's pretty representative.
Wow, we're starting off well here. That's very nice. I'm currently at Michigan State University, and the title I carry then is executive in residence. I spent about half my time outreach into the market and research community, and about half my time teaching in the Master's of Science and Marketing Research program there. So I joined at the end of 2014 after I was able to retire from Merritt's. So I spent my career in the field of marketing research, and most of it with Merritt's, who's a fairly large full-service marketing research company focusing on customer experience, and I was the CEO there for the last 11 years. And I was fortunate to be able to retire it out early, and I was involved in the industry in terms of helping universities start Masters of Marketing Research programs. And Michigan State University was one of them that I was involved with, and they extended an opportunity to sort of stay engaged in the industry in my retirement and become involved. And so I joined the faculty there then, and absolutely loving it. And it's given me the opportunity to work directly with companies like HCD in really focusing on bringing into the program emerging techniques, companies that are really applying techniques in very creative ways to drive the transformation in the industry, and that's the primary focus I bring.
Yeah, I think that is actually really exciting what you're doing at Michigan State. That struck me as being really different. You know, the first time we started talking and you invited me out there to speak to your classes, you know, I think it's really great what you're doing to really expose students to real people doing real work and really learning, you know, valuable tools that they will really be using. You know, I think we've talked a little bit, you've probably heard our fearless leader, Glenn Kessler, talk about how, you know, his experience with his MBA, there are all sorts of things he feels he didn't, you know, learn. You know, also he talks about how, you know, whether things have really changed much since his, you know, MBA that he got back in, I don't remember if it was like the 60s, late 60s, I think. You know, so when he talks about that, he wonders how much things have really changed in what people are being taught. But I think most recently, in particular with your program, there really has been a lot of outreach to application of what people are really doing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's, to me, what was the real attraction, and why I really choose to stay engaged, because the goal is to really find that, almost that combination that you're talking about, in terms of what I would say the foundational elements of an education in our space, and the experience or the application element of that. Because I think, kind of to Glenn's point, it just is such a reflection of what we're all living through in this space right now. Because you think about it, and it's reflected in when I went through to create the data as part of this whole offering, is we're in such a state of flux in our space, where I guess a lot of it is because there's so many new players, new offerings, new ways of thinking that have come into our space in the last 5, 7, 10 years. And a lot of folks in our industry would see a positive in that, see a threat in that. But then there's just so much transformation required in the business, and we're really in the state of transition. And so, to your point earlier, is a program like ours at Michigan State, the Master's of Science Marketing Research program, is really all designed about creating that next generation of leader. And we believe, to create that next generation of leader right now, that person has to come out being able to bridge the foundational world with this very much emerging world that is in the process of transforming. And our belief is that the proper way to do that, or the appropriate way to do that, is really two-part. It's continuing to teach what we were all taught, the foundational disciplines that go all the way back to a lot of those equations that are foundational to what we do haven't changed since 1940 or 1950 or whatever. And to be solid in this space, you need to understand those. And those are the time-tested disciplines. But the reality is if somebody's walking out of school right now into a role in your company or anywhere, they're spending a lot of time doing things other than probability sampling and random dialing and a lot of those other things. It's important that they know that to be able to assess quality. But the reality is, what they're walking into are all these technology-enabled tools and DIY tools and techniques and very different approaches. And it's going to be like that for quite a while, maybe another 10 years of this flux. And we believe that the true leaders, the next generation leaders, have to be able to bridge the understanding. Yeah, they can have, well, actually, to me, it's a reflection of why I was attracted to HCD and a lot of your writing in particular, Michelle, is because, to me, it reflected that the and that has to occur, right? Because it is saying we are going to leverage these newly disciplines, these new developed disciplines. We're going to find ways to really maximize the impact of those, while also understanding we have to continue to apply the time-tested principles so that we can say to our clients, yes, you have this tool and you're leveraging ubiquity of data and isn't this wonderful and so forth, but just use that directionally for this. Don't go and sell the farm on this, because there's this issue of accuracy and this issue of projectability and so forth. And that's, to me, what's required, is the ability to bridge that. It's an and. And there aren't a lot of people out there that are able to do that right now. And so we think that's a huge opportunity, but it involves bringing folks like you into the classroom. We have to have the foundational teachings, and those can be done by the time-tested principles that traditional faculty are teaching.
Yeah.
And we also need to teach the emerging. And that's going to come from people like you who are adapting, who are changing the emerging every day.
Right.
And that's not going to come out of a textbook.
Right.
Now that, we believe, is going to come by finding that right mix of bringing folks from the application side into the classroom.
I do think that, exposure opens people's minds, right? So I think, a lot of what we see in practice now with, the higher ups at different organizations is that, they're kind of going in blind a little bit. So they may have heard something at a conference that they went to, a little hint of some sort of new techniques being done, but because maybe they haven't had as much exposure, but also, when you get more exposure to lots of different approaches, then you can be a bit more critical about them as well. And I think there is something very important about that, being able to look at new things that come up and be able to evaluate whether or not it's just a fad or if there's really some meat there to it. And I think that that's, critical thinking is a real skill, and sometimes seeing the good and the bad that people are doing out there is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Kathryn.
Yeah, I would just compliment with what Michelle was saying by mentioning how your background in actually being in industry and really walking the walk, you can speak to your experiences to the classroom and say, I've seen this, tried and true method work in this application, but I've also seen it not be applied in the best manner. And this is what it resulted in. And I think you can actually take from your background and that the fact that you bring it to the classroom gives these students so much more of, like you said, exposure to this opportunity to really leverage both worlds together, because the truth of the matter is both worlds need each other to progress.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the key right there. I think you hit on it right there.
And kind of speaking of progression, there's this conversation we've been having a lot this year, really around norms. And a lot of this was really pushed because of the events of 2020, right? But of course, at HCD, looking at, we have norms that we've used in doing ad testing. But we saw changes that happened in 2008 to 2010 when there was, the market crash, particularly in, pharmaceutical area where we do a lot of business. We saw that trying to assess consumer response, it had shifted, right, over time because of the events that happened. And so the question kind of became, what is the utility of norms? So when you're teaching about norms, what do you see going on there? Like what is a norm basically?
Well, what we're teaching is the value and purpose or reason for being of a norm is not changing. Mm-hmm. And the reason why norms were established and being used for decades and decades is not changing. The value and the importance of it. Mm-hmm. And if we're developing you as a leader to go into the organization, you have to evangelize on the fact that normative data is so important and its role in putting into perspective the insights that you are generating.
Right. So perspective is key because, what are you comparing? You have to compare to something, right?
Exactly. And that's, to me, akin to continuing to reinforce the fundamental. That story hasn't changed in decades.
Yeah. Because how do you know you're performing well unless you have some sort of metric? Right?
Exactly. And I would hope 30 years from now, 4 years from now, they're still saying the importance of norms.
Yeah.
So then there's the second side. And there's the emerging, and they're saying, and now what do norms mean within the environment that you're in right now that is so much in flux and that is changing, and that there are so many new players bringing insights bringing data in. Maybe you go to a conference now, and people are setting tables up, and a year ago there were two guys in a garage with some app that it was being used in some other industry. And they're saying, well, this has got some integrated data and some visuals. Maybe it was a research tool. Let's try it out.
Yeah.
And so now, what does the principles of normative data have not gone away, have not changed, but how do we apply them?
Yeah.
In this world? How do we apply them when 3/4 of the companies that are showing their wares there are creating unstructured data?
Interesting.
And so that then becomes, I think, the next generation challenge about saying is okay, we have to look at norms. And I watched one of your prior videos, and I know some of your speakers talked a lot about that in terms of saying, okay, on an applications front, the application of norms, the creation of norms with these new ways of gathering and presenting data is changing. And I think that's a huge opportunity for the next generation of leaders coming out.
Yeah, because there is a lot of talk over emotional value when you're thinking about how people react to brands, right? Or their product experiences, or advertising. Obviously, emotions, they've always been important, but I feel like, it's talked about a lot more these days with the different measurements that have come out. And so there may be value in being able to incorporate measures of emotion within a norm, right? And then there's also, of course, AI and big data, right? So our access to more data and more information can certainly inform us better. But do you think that it potentially causes more difficulties, or like where do you see like all this extra information coming? How do you sort through it?
I do agree in the beginning, it adds a lot of additional difficulties. And I think it's twofold. One is a lot of different types of information coming in, and a lot of different types of measures of accuracy or non-measures that really cloud. We can't take for granted being able to assemble data in the same way to be able to use in a normative fashion. And so I think that is a huge challenge. And then I would add another dimension of the challenge in terms of an application of norms in the near term, and that's reflected in who's now becoming the insights person. And I just, in the last month, I read two different studies, one from SMR and one from the Green Book created. They were both coming in from different angles, but one of their major findings was just reinforcing what we have seen happen and seen over many years and seen accelerated because of the pandemic in the last year. And that was within client brand organizations, the shift in terms of from the insights, centralized insights department to the end user in terms of actually being the insights professional. And so more and more, it's as if you're in the you're in the insights department, let's say at Procter & Gamble or Microsoft or somewhere, where traditionally your role was to create, to gather the research, to analyze it, to apply norms and the interpretation, and then to feed that results to the end user, being a product planner or whatever. Well, increasingly the product planner or whoever is saying, oh, I got the tools. I can access the panel data. I got this. Yeah. And they're now not only the end user, but they are really being the researcher, the person.
That's interesting. I definitely saw that in my experiences at Mars and Johnson & Johnson, where people I worked with on product development did shift their roles over to, CMIs, they might call it, right? The insights group. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and again, the data was saying in the last year, because people working from home and so forth, that's even accelerated.
Yeah, it makes sense because you want to be able to communicate well what these norms are actually telling you, but also to keep in mind the context in which the norms are being measured, because that obviously is going to affect whatever you're working on. So
Yeah.
it would make sense that they tie together quite nicely.
Now,
Yeah.
having played the role as, CEO, you have so much experience in that role of sort of developing an organization and having organizational changes as well. Do you think that that's reflective of those sort of organizational changes that these companies are having to try to, a lot of times they try to trim the fat or, streamline things, and they change the way the organization is run? Do you see that as something that's coming from top down, or some sort of more natural progression?
Well, on the client side, on the brand side?
Yeah, like the
Yeah.
move from product people to become, consumer insight, taking over that role.
I don't think it was top down. It's being top down. I think if anything is bottom up, it's being as a result of, some people would use the term democratization of insights or whatever, but I think a lot of it's been tool driven. It's been the ubiquity of data driven. It's been the availability of data driven, and it's been so people at the kind of the end of the chain, the end users, the non-researchers are saying, "What? But I can do this."
Yeah.
I have. Yeah, I got Survey Monkey, so I'm a research genius. And so and you don't want to discourage that. So
Right.
if you are kind of looking at the top, you don't want to discourage, because what's better than having everybody in the organization focused on bringing the voice of the customer in to drive the decision-making process? Wonderful, but it scares the heck out of
Yeah.
you. Decentralized any sort of control. I'm bringing it back to the conversation around norms. Is that the application of norms is a very process and a codified kind of approach in an organization, because you decide how you're going to establish your norms. You decide the source of your norms. You're going to apply those, and it's a big part of your kind of your cultural interpretation of the data. And now all of a sudden, and you have a lot of people who would not really understand what you're talking about when you talk about normative data, right? Because they don't have a research background. And so it's and again, so it was kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it's more of a percolated up because of the enablement of people through tools and techniques,
like a DIY revolution of sorts.
Exactly.
And accessibility.
Accessibility.
And it's cheaper, right, to write up a survey on SurveyMonkey as opposed to going to some other organization to run, some really in-depth analysis of some sort, right?
Yeah, and you hear the end users. I'm okay with roughly right. It's kind of speed over accuracy. If I send it down the hall to the centralized department, it's going to take 2 weeks, and I just want to, and so it's a and from where you are on the agency organization, I grew up on the agency organization as well, and you're trying to support the brands. It really it creates an interesting situation, because are we working with the centralized department to help them help the users at the end, or are we working directly with the users, or it's a very interesting dynamic that's forming.
That's really interesting to look at it that way.
It does. And I think also trying to figure out who you support does bring us really into this conversation of support someone now through the experience that we all just went through of COVID-19. How do you help your companies or your clients best work with the norms that they now have to utilize them in the best capacity in which, they see.
Now, there really is such a shift on the processes that people are using, though. And we were just, I was just in a call with a client that we've had for a very long time. And, we didn't always do their qualitative work, as an example, but, they've used a lot of other people, and they've used us in the past to do some qualitative work. But, with what happened in 2020 with, so many things moving online, they actually did start doing it themselves quite a bit. And one thing that they were telling us is that they feel so much more control over the data to do it themselves, and these are product development people, not necessarily insights people, like you were saying. So I think once they had the tools to just be able to run groups from all over the country, they maybe skipped some sets that, we would have normally done if we, were in the before times, right? The BC times. But that is very interesting. It kind of changes even what was, normal for qualitative. We've been talking about norms in this sense, but I think it's changed kind of all over the board, whether it's because of this bottom-up DIY revolution or because, so many people started moving things online and had access to new tools.
Yes, yeah. And I think that could create a new opportunity for a company like HCD relative to norms, relative to a lot of the different value you bring to your organization, is that it may be a greater role of education because need to help that end user who may not be a researcher at all understand the guardrails of how to use the insights in a way that is appropriate, and to understand what's just directional versus what you can you can sell the company on. And norms is a great example of that. I could see bringing a great value to an organization in terms of educating the end user in their language about what normative data is really all about and what it means to them. Maybe that's the role of the centralized research department now, is to really do that education, but maybe a partner agency can really do that well as well.
Yeah, no, those are really interesting ideas. Yeah, thank you for that. I think, we've definitely had some interesting things happen in this past year where it is very much like what you've been talking about, where people have been sort of asking more of these questions. They've been a little bit more open to learning about other approaches and techniques, and maybe even more open to this DIY revolution of being able to, kind of taking, norms typically rely on someone else doing a lot of the work, right? If you're, CMI or, product researcher, going to bases, for example, or going to a company that has some proprietary metric. But I think, there seems to be a bit of a shift. So that is really interesting to think about.
And education is so important too, because if you do have this bottom up approach, what good is it having all of this data if you don't know how to analyze it and how to really compare it so that way you know what you're looking at. So it does need to be a lot of not just hand-holding, but really guidance into the way to appropriately collect this data, but also to know what to do with it after the fact.
Interpretation is always really hard, I think. And, that's where, the experience and skill comes in. So, even if, you're coming from the bottom up and you're doing a DIY and you're trying to set up your own norm now, rather than going to bases or going to somebody else to give you their metric, their proprietary metric. Sometimes it can be very difficult to understand how to correctly interpret things. To your point, those foundations that are really important to be able to make predictions or, to make comparisons. Sometimes there's a step that's missing there. We talk about it a lot with, the applied neuroscience area, that anybody can go out and buy an EEG headset. And you can hang out a sign in front of your house that says neuromarketer, right? No one's going to stop you. There's no rules. You can order something off of, eBay or Amazon and do it tomorrow. So, I think there's something very important there about that education piece to make sure that everybody is kind of making the right decisions still, right?
Yeah, and I think it's become even that much more of a challenge. I mean, I don't mean to pile on and make this seem disconcerting. But the other thing that you've talked about on several of your other modules is the idea of integration of disparate sources of information that, again, is becoming that much more common. And so how us who've been around quite a while, in terms of we think of normative data, it's pretty straightforward in that it's structured. It's a certain type of data that is collected in a certain kind of way, and we compare it side by side, and they're like to like. Well, of course, now it's all about integrating multiple sources of disparate data, whether it's structured data gathered in a scalar way together with stuff that's been scraped down in this environment, or stuff that's been captured in an ethnographic format, or whatever.
Yeah.
But the need for a normative benchmark and interpretation doesn't go away.
Yeah.
It's just how in the world, and maybe this is something you tackled in one of your other modules, but how do you create a normative solution against these multiple disparate data sets and different data structure sets? And then how do you take that and educate? Not the central department, but the end user.
That's the real question. And we do get that a lot. I think we did have a conversation with John Ennis at Agora where he was, he's part of this whole AI sort of movement on how to deal with data. And he talks a lot about graph databases and how you can pull from different sources of information to try to connect the dots. I think there's a piece there that a lot of researchers are missing, which is, the sort of AI revolution of how to bring data together and how to understand data better.
Yeah. I think that, and that's a conversation is kind of full turn here in terms of bringing people into the classroom, specifically what we're doing at Michigan State, and a conference now. I would say at least 2/3 of the tables there, with the backdrops, there's a story, there's the storyboard behind everybody's table, says something about AI, maybe 3/4, right? I'm using AI.
We make that joke a lot that, if you didn't mention AI in your talk, was it even a talk?
Exactly. And so now, however, what does that mean?
Yeah. And
there's a tremendous example of where I rely on, the university relies on experts in the field. So people like yourselves who are really pushing the application of it and inventing the application of it every day and morphing it every day. And that's what these future leaders have to hear, knowing that it's going to change. It may change monthly, but what's the latest in terms of applying this and applying the example of terms of AI to really turn all that unstructured data into structured data and therefore give us a chance to creating a normative structure. To me, the best way of doing that is to bring experts in from the field.
I remember when we first spoke at, I believe it was at a conference, and I think that it's so great that you do attend these conferences as an educator, to be able to see kind of what that latest thing is, like what is the buzzword that's going on, because these students are going to need to know what those buzzwords are, like what they mean.
Yeah, that's where I met you. You spoke. I said, I need to talk to that person. I chased you down. I followed you around the whole conference. You probably thought, who's that creepy guy?
I love it. No, I think it's great. I mean, that's something that I do miss with, COVID-19. We do have, these online conferences that are happening now, but we are missing that aspect of meeting someone in the hallways, meeting someone at a booth, having a conversation at the water cooler, coffee maker, whatever it might be. Absolutely. There is something missing there. Yeah.
Yeah, fingers crossed that comes back soon.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you joining us, and I think this conversation was really great. I think, having that added insight in how to educate the next leaders is so very important, and learning how to have an open mind but also a critical eye is really key. So I definitely appreciate what you're doing, and thank you so much for joining us.
As long as I get to get both of you back in my classroom soon.
We would love to.
Okay.
There's nothing we love more than being in Michigan in February, for example. But definitely thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody who's watching or listening in. Don't forget to subscribe to continue to join us on this, and also comment below and like this video, because it was a great conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions for Michael in particular about his program, or if you'd like to reach out to hear more about what he's been doing for outreach, or you have any questions for us, feel free to email us directly, tweet with us, visit our blog, link with us on LinkedIn, and of course subscribe and like this video and series. So again, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Take care. Bye.